In this video, we're going to take a first look at the field of communication studies. Many of us feel like we already have a good grasp on how to communicate, and the truth is we do know a lot about communication. But in this class, we're going to study communication. We're going to look at what the research says, and then we're going to look at lots of ways to communicate better. But before we get too deeply into research, this week we're going to focus on the basics around communication. The reasons we communicate, the definition of communication, the model of communication, different types of communication, and finally some characteristics of being a competent communicator. So let's get started by talking about the definition of communication. According to communication theorists, communication is defined as the process of using signs, symbols, and behaviors to exchange information and share meaning. Simple, right? Well, maybe not. Let's break that definition down a little bit. So first, let's talk about communication being a process. That means that there are specific steps or actions that we take that we expect to end up in the result of communication. When we call communication a process, it has certain implications on what communication means. First of all, it means that there's some expectations about how to do communication right or wrong. So when people don't follow the rules, we judge them as being odd or different or not doing it right. Did you notice I used the word rules? We have rules around how to communicate. Different groups, different cultures, all have different rules of what's acceptable. Of course, oftentimes these rules aren't stated. We just kind of know them, and that's one of the things that makes communication complex. As we go through the course, we'll talk about this process and rules more, but for now, you have a pretty good idea about it. The second part of the definition of communication is that it's signs, symbols, and behaviors. The signs and symbols part refers to the language we speak. So, for example, most of us understand the meaning behind these different letters and where and when we use them. But what about these? Probably not for most of us. That's because signs and symbols only have the meaning that we give them. When we talk about behavior in the definition of communication, we're talking about non-verbal behaviors. So these are facial expressions, gestures, the way we use our body, a whole myriad of things that have communication value. The final part of the definition is exchanging information and creating meaning. Most of us understand that when we communicate, we're trying to share information between people, so it goes back and forth in an exchange. And if you notice, we are attempting to create meaning and understand each other, but the problem is sometimes that goes wrong. We don't always share the same meaning. Now you have a better understanding of how communication is a process, how we use signs, symbols, and behaviors to exchange information and create meaning. Not as difficult as it was in the beginning, huh? So now let's talk about why we communicate. First of all, communication is a physical need. This means that if we don't have it, our mental and physical health can suffer. We literally cannot survive well without human communication. For example, let's look at an experiment that was conducted by Frederick II, the Emperor of Germany in the 13th century. The emperor wanted to discover what language humans would speak naturally if they were not taught a specific language. So to figure this out, Edward placed 50 newborns with their nurses, and the nurses were told to only care, feed, and bathe them, not to speak or to hold them. Frederick never found the answer to his question because all of the newborns died. This study showed the importance of human interaction to survival, particularly touch, which is a form of nonverbal communication. More ethical and contemporary studies conducted today show that there is a positive relationship between good social interaction and overall human health. For example, the study showed that without strong social ties, people are more likely to suffer ailments such as high blood pressure and heart disease. They are also more likely to suffer from common ailments such as the cold and to take longer to recover from both common ailments and injuries. We also communicate with others to fill certain relational needs. We want companionship, we want others to listen to and understand us, we want affection, and we just want the ability to get away with someone else and relax. So just like the studies show an impact on physical health, they also show that mental health is majorly impacted by filling these relational needs with communication. We also communicate to fill our identity needs. We learn about ourselves from how others communicate with us. We listen to what people think good or bad about us. We compare ourselves to others, and we judge what we think people are trying to communicate to us. All this communication works together to form our perceptions of ourselves and our identity of who we are. Finally, communication serves instrumental needs. We just need to order that drink at the bar or order that item on Amazon. It just helps us get things done. In order for us to understand the process of communication, we need to have some common ground or models that we use to understand the communication process. There are many different models of communication, but I'm only going to cover a few to try to help you understand the basics and then understand how complex communication really can be. One of the simplest models of communication is Berlow's SMCR model of communication. It basically says that a source encodes a message through a channel and then a receiver decodes it. So let's break this model down a little by looking at some of the definitions of each of the elements of the model. The source is the individual, group, or company that decides to send a message. They have an idea or thought that they would like to share. The source is the first place that complexity enters the model of communication. Whether it be an individual, a company, or a group of people, the source has its own unique characteristics that impact its ability to communicate. Here are just a couple of examples. First, different sources have different capabilities and competencies relative to their communication skills. They also will have different attitudes and values and beliefs towards the audience, the subject matter, and all other types of elements of the message. They will have different levels of knowledge about the audience, the subject, and the situation. They also may have different social backgrounds, educations, friends, salaries, cultures, all other types of characteristics that influence their communication. These different characteristics and ways that the source and ultimately the receiver communicate in the world are called frames of reference or fields of experience. It's just their different ways of looking at the world, almost like looking at it through different pairs of glasses. Therefore, when the source creates the message, they bring all their perceptions, judgments, precognitions into their creation of the message. Since no two people are the same, this makes the communication from the source very complex. You'll also notice that your receiver has all the same characteristics as your source. When a source encodes a message, they're making choices about the language and gestures they are going to use to communicate their idea. The message is the verbal and nonverbal signs, symbols, and behaviors that the source uses to encode the message. Just like with the source, there's a lot of complexity that goes into the development of the message. There's what content to exclude or include in the message. There's the structure of the message and how simple or complex it should be. There's the type of codes used to determine the message, verbal or nonverbal. There's how the message is treated. Is it serious and important, or is it more fun and easygoing? These are all decisions that the source has to make about the message. In the process of creating the message, the source also chooses a channel through which to communicate the message. This is basically the pathway through which the message is conveyed. Channels have different characteristics. For example, if we're face-to-face, we can actually hear, see, smell, and touch. But if we're receiving a message, say through text, all we can do is really see the message. We can't really hear the tones. We can't touch or see what's going on in the environment. In other words, some channels provide more information than other channels. So at face-to-face, I have pretty much all the information possible, where in other channels, I lose information about the message. This difference in information across channels is called media richness, and we'll learn about this in another video. The receiver is the party who interprets the message. They have all the same characteristics as the source. They have different communication skills, cultures, knowledge, social systems, and backgrounds. The receiver then decodes, which means they interpret or give the message their own meaning. This could be the same as what the receiver intended, a little different, or totally on a whole nother level. When you put it all together, you get a model that looks something like this. You can see now that our source encoding the message through a channel and decoding it through a receiver has become a lot more complex. But believe it or not, the SMCR model is actually a very simple model of communication. So let's look at some additional models. This is a diagram of the Shannon-Weaver model, and you can see that it has all the same elements as the SMCR model, but it also adds a couple of new elements. Noise and feedback are the two new concepts that are added, so let's talk about them. Noise is anything that distracts or interferes with the message. There's many different types of noise that might do this. The first is physical noise. This is what we would typically think of as noise. Sounds in the environment that make us not able to hear, or static over a TV or radio transmission. The second type of noise is psychological noise. These are basically thoughts in our head that are distracting us, or emotions that may impact the way we receive the message. The third type of noise is physiological noise, and this is just distractions that come from the basic biology of our body, such as hunger, fatigue, or poor hearing. The final type of noise is semantic noise, and this means that we have different meanings of words, people use jargon that we don't understand, or they have accents that we don't understand. The Shannon-Weaver model introduces the concept of feedback. This is basically the receiver's responses to the source's message. It can be nonverbal and verbal, just like a regular message. By adding the concept of feedback, Shannon and Weaver is pointing out that communication is not one way, but two-way. The final model of communication is the transactional model of communication, and it basically adds a few elements and takes into account all the elements of the other models. The transactional model adds the idea of communicators versus source and receivers. It basically means that we are simultaneously receiving and sending messages at the same time, that there's no back and forth, that it occurs mutually all the time. The transactional model adds the idea of context, and that's the idea that communication occurs in a physical or psychological environment that impacts the communication. The physical context is the place and time of the communication. This could be the same or different for the receivers. So sometimes we could be communicating at the same time and place. Other times I could be sending a message to you and you could be receiving it at a different time and place. The physical context is basically the state of mind around the interaction. How formal is it? What's the degree of privacy? Is the situation emotionally charged? The transactional model of communication argues that the context, where we are and what our mindset are, have huge impacts on how we communicate and how well we receive communication. The transactional model of communication also looks at how communication occurs over time. So it includes the idea that our past communications impact our current communication, and we can't look at any communication as just a snapshot in time. So for example, when I communicate with my husband, my communication today is the sum of all the different communication events we've had over our entire relationship. So that's a lot of vocabulary and a lot of complexity in those models of communications. So what should you really pull from all of this? First, I want you to understand that communication is governed by rules, and there are certain expectations that we have about how to communicate. They're mainly not spoken, but they're there all the same. Second, in every communication, there's a literal meaning of what's being said, but there's also relational elements that tell us how to understand that message. So tone of voice, body language, they all influence the message and how it's received. Third, in any communication, it is influenced by the perception of the communicators. Having to pass through these filters means that there's multiple meanings of the same message, and it makes communication very complex. What this means is that there's no one objective meaning of a message. It's people that determine what the meaning of the message is. so there's no one meaning. Now that you understand a little bit more about communication, let's talk about the 5 types of communication that we'll cover in this class. The first type of communication is intrapersonal communication. This is communication that you have with yourself in your head, where you basically talk to yourself. It's not just thoughts, but it's you saying things back and forth to yourself. Interpersonal communication is communication between 2 people in the context of an ongoing relationship. On a day-to-day basis, this is the most common form of communication. Small group communication occurs when groups of 3 to 20 people work together to accomplish a task. These could be sports teams, Bible studies groups, organizational departments, and teams of students working on a class project. Public communication, better known as public speaking, is when you speak to an audience that's larger than a small group. This is generally face-to-face, but can also occur virtually. Mass communication is when we transmit information via electronic media to large audiences. These are items such as television, magazines, newspapers, blogs, radios, and websites. We will discuss all of these types of communication in the course. To finish up this session, I'd like to talk about the characteristics of a competent communicator. Competent communicators are effective and appropriate. Being effective means that you achieve the goal that you intend when you start the communication. So if I'm trying to get somebody to wear a mask, they actually do it. That's my communication goal, to get them to wear a mask. Being appropriate means adhering to the rules and expectations that apply in any social situation. It means not offending someone while you're in the process of gaining their agreement. When you choose to be appropriate in communication, you're recognizing that your communication is going to move into the future. So it's not just a one-time thing. You want to maintain the relationship. If we go back to our mask order, you could talk about the difference between encouraging people to wear a mask and requiring them to wear a mask. There is a difference in communication appropriateness and how people feel about it. Honestly, the appropriateness of the communication is all about being able to communicate successfully over time, and it definitely impacts your ability to achieve your goal. To be an effective communicator, there's a number of skills that you need. The first is self-awareness of your own behavior and how it impacts those around you. This is called self-monitoring. People who are high self-monitors pay close attention to how they look, sound, and act in social situations. In contrast, low self-monitors really are oblivious to how their behavior and actions may be causing other people to react. Good communicators are also adaptable. That means that they adjust their behavior and communication based on the situation. Competent communicators are also empathic. That means that they're other-oriented and think about how other people are feeling. They are always thinking about issues from the other person's perspective and considering how that might impact the communication. Competent communicators are also cognitively complex. That means that rather than thinking of one explanation for a situation, they think about a number of different factors that could be going on in a communication situation. For example, if I text my teacher and she doesn't respond back, I don't just assume that she's ignoring me. I think of other things that might have happened, like she missed the message, or she's sick, or she's got a lot going on. That's cognitive complexity, not just jumping to the first conclusion and running down a path without thinking about all the things that could be going on. Finally, competent communicators are ethical. That means they're guided by right and wrong. They seek to have an outcome that's fair, honest, and not immoral or unethical. All these skills are skills that we'll be working a little bit on in this class, but we'll only touch the tip of the iceberg. So finally, this brings this lecture to a wrap. I hope that you feel like you know a little bit more about communication as a result of this video. And if you have any questions, reach out to me. I'll be glad to help you out. Thank you for watching and have a great day.